This conference is being recorded.
Good afternoon and welcome to ASTO's webinar, Messaging Sexual Violence Prevention. I'm Mandy Deutsch, Director of Public and Behavioral Health Integration at ASTO. I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items to begin with. I just wanted to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded. In the chat box located on your screen, please indicate the organization or state health department that you're from. Additionally, throughout the session, please type in any questions, comments, or resources that you would like to share with the group. Thank you all for joining today. Your participation is what will make this webinar successful. I'm going to do a brief overview of ASTO to begin with. Our vision is healthy people thriving in a nation free of preventable illness and injury. Our mission is to transform public health within states and territories to help members dramatically improve health and wellness. Elevating sexual violence prevention as a public health issue will require our collective effort, and it is our goal to host a webinar that can provide you all with various framing and messaging techniques to aid in the conversation. The goals of today's webinar are to understand how moral foundations theory can be used to strengthen communication and messaging around sexual violence prevention, to discuss the lessons learned from the messages of the MeToo movement, to identify techniques to educate policymakers about sexual violence prevention efforts, and to explore the need to develop new resources to improve messaging around sexual violence prevention. We will have three presenters for you today. We have Jean Matthews, who is the Director of the Network for Public Health Law Southeastern Region Office, Dr. Sue Lynn Ledford, who is the Division Director, Wake County Human Services Public Health, and Colleen Healy-Boufitis, who is the Senior Staff Attorney, the Network for Public Health Law Mid-States Region at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. I would like to now hand it over to Jean Matthews, who will be presenting on moral foundations theory and how it can be used to elevate sexual violence messaging.
Okay, well, thank you. I assume you're able to hear me all right, and it's an honor and a treat for us to be here today. We were asked by Andy Baker-White at ASTO if we could provide some assistance to you on being able to get all the great sexual violence prevention material that you put together during this initiative, how to get it messaged into the attention of policymakers. And we had done a presentation about moral foundations theory and crafting richer messages last summer at the ASTO Deputies meeting in Washington, D.C. And so I think that was the reason ASTO asked us to see if we could do something that would assist you at this stage in your initiative that you've been doing, your states have been doing for a number of years. So we expect this to not be a sleepy session. We expect that we will get questions from you, and be sure and put them in the chat box. We will hope to save 15 to 20 minutes at the end to have a fielding of questions and discuss what is of interest to you. We have some already that were submitted before. We will jump off with one or two of those, but we're most interested in your reaction. So as indicated there, I will talk first about just the basic moral foundations theory. I think you had the paper sent to you in advance that lays it out in more detail. Then Dr. Sue Lynn Ledford from Wake County, Raleigh, North Carolina, the health director, will talk about practical examples to use when you're trying to build partnerships with people who are different. And then Colleen Healy-Buffides of our Network for Public Health Law office in Ann Arbor has some really interesting approaches regarding how social media applies to this, how it relates to the millennial generations coming into the workforce. So I'm watching the time. I need to get moving. So let me just give you a quick review of Mall Foundation's Theory 101. And this is the framework that came out of Jonathan Haidt's book from 2012, The Righteous Mind. And this process has evolved quite some time. By the way, I should point out, these PowerPoints are all in the public domain. You can get them afterwards. You're welcome to them and use them as you see fit. So this is a body of work that's evolved over about 3 years now under various titles of crafting richer messages or public health messaging in a turbulent political environment, which I believe is the title of the article you have. And we will try to go quick. Very briefly here, Haidt talks about, and this is no stunning revelation to any of you, that we react more to our intuitions and our rational strategic reasoning comes along second. We're sort of 90% intuitive elephant when we make social and political judgments. And then we have a 10% rational brain riding up on the top that tries to sense where the elephant wants to go and help rationalize it. And our colleague Scott Burris has done a lot of brilliant work on that. You can find it. But just to move quickly, I want to give you sort of the 6 small intuitive values that Haidt identified and talk a little bit about how that applies in the U.S. Population with rather surprising outcomes. So Haidt postulated in his book 6 small foundational values. These are hardwired in us. They are not, they've evolved through evolutionary time from the point when we all came out onto the Serengeti Plain or in the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley and started socially organizing ourselves. So to a certain extent, we are all impacted by these 6 values. The first 3 in our articles, we have referred to these as the liberal flavored values. That may be a misnomer for public health, but I'll get to that in a moment. I've sort of blocked them out in blue here. So let me just quickly run through them. So intuitive value number 1, we all resonate to care and harm. We want to help those in need, have compassion for those that are suffering or vulnerable. And each one of these values sort of has a reciprocal value. So care, the reciprocal is harm, protecting against harm. So that's pretty straightforward. The second is liberty oppression. So we want to have free choices and act and move about freely. And the reciprocal of oppression, we're intolerant of bullies. We don't like that, and we don't like those that try to repress our own individual freedom. And then the third one is fairness or cheating. So again, pretty straightforward. People expect to be treated fairly and to, get what they deserve, get what they earn. And the reciprocal of that is social intolerance of free riders. We don't like people that are, scamming the system. I spent time out in the Western Pacific shortly after law school and went out to some pretty remote atolls that were all subsistence. And if you didn't participate in your fair share of helping catch the fish or harvest the coconuts or whatever, you could get voted off that island in a rather non-virtual way, and it wouldn't be particularly fun. So these are intuitive, hardwired values that we all resonate to. And then the second 3, which we might misname conservative flavored, are listed here. So loyalty, betrayal. We are loyal to our family, to our community, to our big red team, to our political party, to our country. In the era of social media, those boundaries of who we're loyal to and our group identity can expand and contract rather quickly. But loyalty is something that we're hardwired with. And the reciprocal of that is betrayal. We do not like those who betray us. So there, I think this is the visual of King Solomon being jealous of David after slaying the Goliath, and we don't. That doesn't go down well, and we don't like that trait in our cultures. So that leads then into number 5, authority and subversion. From the time of, say, again, when tribes started congregating into groups and cultures and clans, those who had good leaders had a competitive advantage as organized groups over those that didn't. And so, like Alexander the Great, he came up with, he was a good leader, visionary. He didn't enslave those that he conquered. He said, you join our big team and we'll go on and assimilate the next country over, and he did so. Now, the reciprocal of that is then intolerance of those who subvert the system. In the military, don't buck the system, private. So we're hardwired not to like those that aren't going along with the system. And then last is sanctity degradation. And this is more than simply a religious value, though established and unestablished religion certainly fits in that. But Haidt talks about it as some parts of the human spirit are elevated and pure and almost transcend individual human events. And the reciprocal of that then is our social aversion to personal degradation. Those who are addicted behavior, whether it be sex or drugs or alcohol or gambling or whatever, or just not playing with the game. So mindful of time, let me just sort of move on. Here's what Haidt then did. These values can be tested and replicated in different populations, and he did it in Philadelphia around UPenn and in India and in cultures in South America, came back to the U.S. and did this rather large, very valuable analysis of the U.S. population, and he found the most interesting thing that in the U.S. there was a striking difference between political liberals and political conservatives on how they weighed these moral values. So for U.S. liberals, the most important value, the overarching value, was care for victims of oppression, the care standard, care value. And also how was liberty, fairness, and of authority. And then liberals drop off on the second three, loyal, authority, and sanctity. And then what Haidt found, and this can be replicated, is that for U.S. political conservatives, the overarching most sacred value is preservation of the institutions and traditions of a moral community. And interestingly, the conservatives scored high. Let's see if my little clicker will work. Yeah, okay. So the conservatives scored high in the second three here, but they also score almost as high as liberals do on care, fairness, care, liberty, and fairness. And so putting this all together then takes us to what Haidt calls in his book the conservative advantage. Now these visuals are not Haidt's. There's some things I adopted. So, you've got a lawyer making visuals of hard science, social science. So you take it for what it's worth. But this seems to resonate with classes, and I've used it a number of times. So here's how the two look laid right next to each other. And there are three striking things here. The liberals are not surprised that they score themselves this way. Now, they think that conservatives' scores would be the reciprocal of that, and conservatives would be low over here on care, liberty, and fairness. But that's not true. When you talk to liberals and poll them, liberals correctly understand that they score high on the three, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. They also know perfectly well they score high on the early three as well. And they correctly perceive that that liberals' profile looks like this. So this is a conservative, what Haidt terms a conservative advantage, that liberals tend to be playing with only 3 cards most time in a 6-card deck. Conservatives play with all 6 cards when you're talking about intuitive values that motivate us to make social and political decisions. So that's the piece of it. I'm going to stop here talking about politics and liberal conservative, because I want to talk about public health for a second here. So there's interesting research on this that I need to get through. You can find this article down here by Amin. This just came out in December. For those that are hesitant to get vaccines, they score unusually high than the normal population in sanctity value and in the liberty value. So there's real hard research now taking place in public health using moral foundations theory. And finally, let me talk about the public health advantage, because we're now realizing that public health, the workforce, we believe public health actually resonates to all 6 values. That if you take the second 3, if you take loyalty, the heart of public health is community coalition building. If you take authority, public health is a police power doctrine. We will quarantine you. We inspect your food and your business premises. And we're used to doing that. And then sanctity, public health has the nobility of when others are running away from the fire, we run towards Ebola, and we value that, and it's hardwired in us. So we're believing, and we're starting to articulate this in the next paper, that public health has a advantage here because we can speak across the political spectrum, and people can feel safe engaging us in those relationships to improve their communities. And finally, last point, civil discourse is vital to the heart of public health. And this is another, amid all the turmoil, we speak of this in the paper that we sent you. We now feel like there is a window of opportunity opening for a return to civil discourse in our communities. And if you go Google up any of these websites, Better Angels, Living Room Conversations, the work that the Council for Strong America is doing to help liberal organizations think through, like RWJ, how do you message to conservatives? Because public health, I think for 40 years now, has been speaking, whether it be vaccinations or drug abuse or whatever, we speak in the tongue of the liberal values and are missing half the population. So final slide here. We think that it works both ways. Public health cannot function without civil discourse occurring. We can't do community coalition building without there being civil conversations taking place. So up here we need that civil community discourse to occur for us to be able to thrive. But if, as small groups at the local level can talk across their political and religious and social and class and ethnic boundaries, there's plenty that public health can do to add value to that dialogue. If you go back to the work by Better Angels, they have some beautiful skill building activities, and the majority of their examples that they use, once liberals and conservatives know how to talk to each other, are public health examples. So there's a window here to take what Sue Lynn's going to move on now, where you can take this moral foundations theory approach and apply it in very practical situations. So Sue Lynn, I'm off and you're on.
Thank you, Jean. This is a good opportunity for us to talk about these different messaging techniques, and we really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. So welcome from those of us here in North Carolina. I'm going to start out by sharing a couple of examples of how we have used this different messaging, and some of it very intuitively, I would have to say, without at the time fully understanding what we were trying to appeal to, but on retrospectively looking back at this, we can see how we have used this for some period of time. And one of the messages in North Carolina that was, I think, surprising to a lot of people, and if you have not been following what has happened around needle exchange, we had some very progressive laws that were passed in 2016 under a conservative governor, Governor McCrory, and he signed into legislation this extremely progressive exchange program in North Carolina. So as we worked on this, we had been doing this for a long time, okay? We started working with some atypical partners that would not normally be working together on anything such as this. So law enforcement, criminal justice, and our public health and injury prevention folks, as well as our local medical professionals and other respected community leaders, joined forces in the effort to make the communication clear and reach across several different domains. We had worked prior to this for 10 to 15 years trying to use traditional public health messaging. It was not successful. We were getting nowhere, and strangely enough, that was, we had a General Assembly that was led by another party at that time, and we were getting nowhere. We had been focused on educating and doing all the other things that we needed to do, but lo and behold, the changes to the political landscape opened a window of opportunity, and this very bipartisan support passed 88 to 20 in the House and 48 to 2 in the Senate. Let me say, this is not a common thing. This was a bipartisan deal, and we received a lot of support from across that whole spectrum of different people that were helping to message this. And part of the reason we were is, I think I would challenge all of us, and I see an array of participants on this call from all over the U.S. and many other locales, and different types of services. But you've got to remember that all politics really is local. So, and the people that you're messaging to, you've got to understand that they're dealing with situations in their own communities. And for this particular problem, we were dealing with the drug abuse epidemic. It's a very complex issue, and it appeals to many of the moral foundations. It was clearly on the mind of the local constituents that were pressuring these elected officials to act, and there were visible emotional, economic, and social consequences in their communities. Most every legislator knew families at home, sometimes their own, that were dealing with these painful issues. So which deeper values did we use? Well, number one, very often people think, well, you've got to appeal to the dollar. And yes, you do. In a conservative framework, you do need to. I found that you actually need to appeal to the dollar across party lines. That's always a question that we're asked. So it was sound economics. There were several, different savings that we could bring about through the Medicaid dollars. It was definitely linked to authority, because with the law enforcement and the leadership in the communities that these elected officials respected, we were able to appeal from that perspective And I've already mentioned the care, loyalty, and sanctity elements that they were dealing with in their very own communities and sometimes their own families. So I think the lessons in intentional learning are worth us reminding each other that we need to do this. We don't assume that you are here, don't always assume you heard what was said. Sometimes we are so preconceived in what we think we're going to hear that is what we hear, whether it was what was said or not. So make sure that you're listening to both sides and attempting to seek common ground as people are speaking. Pause to reflect on what they're saying. Avoid the assumption that you know their values, because most likely we don't always know the values. I would say also look for those unexpected validators, people that you might not really think would be on your team, but when they hear the stories and they get the deeper message here, they become some of your best proponents. And begin crafting those relationships prior to the time that you need them. This is not just for political figures. This is for any working relationship that we have with our community partners or others that we need to work alongside. And establishing trust. Never, ever deceive or twist the facts. Don't use the data to make it sound like something that it's not really. So think that way. The other thing that I always try to encourage people to consider is that don't use wrong terminology. We use too much jargon. We may have the wrong person speaking. We portray a wrong attitude, a wrong tone. Even sometimes our body language sinks our own ship. And I've sat in way too many meetings when I could see us, those of us that were in the room, some of my public health comrades were actually sinking the ship even as we were talking. Remember basic communication skills. Be smart. Who is the best fit to meet with whoever your policymakers are, whoever the decision makers are? It may not be you. It may be someone that you know that they respect and that they would listen to. One of the stories that we routinely share in our presentations, and if you've heard us before, you would have heard this, but remember that you do not need to make every single point. Sometimes we are so on topic and in our agenda that we are, we're saying too much. So one of the stories that we share is one of our conservative elected officials was listening to some of our team, and we had been presenting our message. We made it short, succinct, and we sold the message readily. He got it. He understood it. And one of my participants that was in the room with me, one of my friends, was sitting there, and he just could not resist continuing to add additional points to try to reinforce the decision. And I will never forget, as this elected official leaned across the table and looked at this young man, and he said, buddy, once you've sold the horse, be quiet, shake hands, and move on. So it was that kind of story where sometimes we can sink our own ship again. The other point I would want to make is don't celebrate too loudly, because if we go out and we say, oh, we convinced this person or that person, we really sold them on this, then they hear that, it goes back, and next time they may not be so willing to listen to you. So also, I want you to consider that don't enter into the discussion with preconceived assumptions. There's lots of articles out there, about victim blaming and all of the other moral foundation issues and people taking up why and when we see victims as responsible. Try to enter the conversation not assuming the worst. And then I say give credit for good work, have respectful persistence. You may not get what you need first time. Understand that incremental change is okay. We did not get everything we wanted when we passed needle exchange first time, but the bill was modified the next year and allowed much more local funding. So how do we better message this sexual violence prevention issue? I think that sometimes we have to consider that we must first discuss other relevant topics to open the door, open the window of opportunity for conversation. Sometimes you don't dive into, the core of your message immediately, but instead you put other topics out there that help people to relate from various moral foundations. Things such as human trafficking or child sexual abuse. These can segue into the sexual violence prevention very nicely. And there's lots of metrics, data out there that we can use. If you consider the issue of human trafficking, it's often linked with drug trafficking. Our conservative communities and elected officials all can agree that we do not like those kinds of things happening in our community, and frequently the human trafficking victims are exploited, abused. That is not well received. One of the messages we use in North Carolina is you can see the stark increase in the number of reported cases in the past just 2 years. Then, segueing into the protecting children from child sexual abuse, understanding that 3 out of 4 adolescents have been sexually assaulted, and looking at all of these different statistics that I've got listed here. And when people hear this, they do not like child sexual abuse. So consider the fact that there are methods to use different types of moral foundations to get your message across, making sure that you use whatever is necessary: social intolerance, authority, care, compassion, loyalty, sanctity, fairness, liberty. You can see from my list here that there are many different angles and perspectives that you can utilize to do this. So I'm going to transfer now to my friend Colleen. So Colleen, can you take it from here, please?
And thank you, Sue Lynn. Let me remind people that I'm not aware this is a shy group. You guys have been through the wars. So please be free to start typing in if you've got questions that come up, things you want us to go a little bit deeper into or double back on. We're here to do that. We will have time for open conversation at the end. So please jump in. Colleen, take it away.
Great, thanks. And thanks everyone for joining us today. For this last segment of the webinar, I'm going to talk about social media as a tool for, and sometimes a hindrance to, effective public health messaging. So my colleague Lizzie Corcoran at the de Beaumont Foundation and I have been looking at the role of millennials in public health messaging more generally. So I'll draw briefly on some of the lessons we've learned in that general context, and then focus on the MeToo movement and messaging about sexual violence prevention. So one of the key factors we've looked at in connection with millennials and public health messaging is technology. Technology is one of the major factors that generational researchers have identified as influencing millennials as well, because it became so pervasive as millennials were growing up. We've used it, referring to we, millennials, I'm a millennial, we've used it and relied on it since we were young adults or even younger. Technology is an important factor not only because of millennials, though, not only because millennials make up a huge portion of our workforce and our communities, but also because the effect of technology and social media on millennials reflects broader cultural and societal changes. So those changes are magnified in millennials because we've grown up with it, but social media is now fundamental to communication among all generations and in all sectors. So increasing use of technology and social media has led to 2 important phenomena. that I wanted to focus on today. One is that because social media requires self-representation in the form of creating a social media profile or crafting an online presence, millennials have grown up building individual more so than group identities. And the second phenomenon is that social media is a key tool for millennials to educate themselves about social issues and to engage with causes. The Millennial Impact Reports, which reflect a huge body of data and analysis on how U.S. millennials interact with causes, those reports indicate that posting or sharing on social media is one of millennials' most frequent advocacy-related actions. So these two factors have led to the two trends that are on this slide, trends among millennials that are important for our conversation today. That first one is that movements that successfully engage millennials tend to be framed around personal identity and self-expression rather than traditional institutions, meaning that it's likely that millennials' passion for a cause, millennials' passion will be focused on a cause rather than on institutional loyalty, such as to a political party or a religious organization. And the second trend is that millennials are masters of virtue signaling, and this phrase refers to our inclination to distill complex moral or social issues into hashtags or tweets to signal moral righteousness and receive external validation. And I just want to reiterate that while these trends are particularly pronounced among millennials, they are so heavily tied to social media use that they affect other generations as well, and especially anyone using social media. So for the next few minutes, we'll look at what those two millennial trends can show us about messaging sexual violence prevention. The first trend, which is towards engaging with causes rather than institutions, presents an opportunity for communicating about sexual violence prevention because it has already elevated that conversation. It has created an environment where people can talk about sexual violence prevention in a different way and has introduced new voices to that conversation. And the trend towards virtue signaling can have exactly the opposite effect because it can shut down communication. Since it's focused on indicating a social identity rather than on listening and communicating, it is especially likely to not use all 6 moral foundations. So we'll dig into each of these trends a little bit deeper, starting first with the opportunity that's presented by the MeToo movement. So this trend was identified in the Millennial Impact Reports, and there are tons of recent movements that demonstrate that trend towards coalescing around issues rather than institutions. And I have a few of those pictures from some of those included here, and this definitely includes the MeToo movement. And this quote comes from a report from Ipsos Mori, which is a marketing analytics firm, and I think it offers an interesting perspective on how the loyalty to cause idea influences millennials. And as this quote explains, millennials look for solutions to problems and then rally around those solutions rather than pledging ongoing allegiance to institutions. And so they end up being more focused on the solution than on where it comes from. So millennials' cause-related behavior is in part a product of social media because participation is part of identity building, but social media also fuels movements by amplifying individual voices. This is especially evident if you look at the history of the MeToo movement, which was launched by Tarana Burke in 2006. The story of the movement's start is a really moving story and one I'd encourage you all to look up. The website, her website is listed right there. And the original goal of the movement was empowerment through empathy and was focused on encouraging women and girls of color to tell their stories of sexual violence and abuse. Though the movement began over 10 years ago, it didn't really take off on a national scale until late 2017 when Hollywood celebrities began to share their stories and began using the hashtag MeToo on Twitter. And I am sure there were a number of reasons that the movement took off when it did, but certainly social media was key to its rapid spread. And as you all know, today there's constant Twitter activity, social media activity using the MeToo hashtag and others that have broadened the conversation. So the MeToo movement has already helped to elevate conversations about sexual violence prevention by creating a platform for discussion and by showing how prevalent sexual harassment and abuse are and how many women, men, and children are affected. Many of the tweets on these next few slides are from just a 1 to 2 day span a few weeks ago. And I think the first one on this slide especially highlights an important outcome of the movement so far. It urges readers to recognize sexual violence as an epidemic rather than as an anomaly, and that opens the door to discussing public health interventions rather than individual responses to sexual violence. The MeToo movement has changed expectations and behavior to some extent as well, especially in cases where men were simply not aware of how their actions might be perceived and experienced by women. It's broadened the conversation about sexual violence and harassment to address women's rights and autonomy in other contexts. And as the conversation continues, I think it has the potential to change our societal narrative about sexual violence in deeper ways by further shifting the focus from individual cases and the question of who's at fault in a particular case to recognizing sexual violence as a societal problem and asking the question of what can we do collectively to prevent it. In addition to paving the way for the MeToo movement, I think the millennial trend of loyalty to cause rather than institutions also lends itself to a helpful mindset that is solution-oriented and focuses first on identifying what needs to be done from among a broad range of possibilities and then on who is best situated to do it, rather than focusing on what can I do within the limitations of my current role and sphere. This cause-focused mindset prompts millennials, especially, to look for and rally around solutions rather than pledging allegiance to institutions. My colleague Lizzie Corcoran at the de Beaumont Foundation calls this fluidity of thinking, and I think that's a great way to think about it. It enables millennials to more naturally shed practices that don't work and seek out non-traditional allies, rather than feeling bound by the four walls of their public health department. And I think this is exactly what's needed to recognize and address the interconnected root causes of sexual violence and to develop coordinated and integrated responses. And then going to Sue Lynn's point, a cause-focused mindset can eliminate the need to worry about who gets credit also. As long as the problem is being solved, it doesn't matter whether the solution comes from public health or comes from public schools, local businesses, other local organizations. So even though the MeToo movement has been a really powerful force for elevating the conversation about sexual violence, there are a few important caveats I think worth mentioning. One is that social media still gives greater voice to those who are already powerful. And in the context of the MeToo movement, there are concerns that it's failing to elevate the voices of working class women and therefore is not really changing much at all for the majority of women who are not celebrities. And a second caveat is that while many people have experienced increased awareness and consciousness because of the movement, many others have been repelled by it and believe it's gone too far. The tweets on this slide show just a couple of different responses. The first one suggesting that the movement is going too far by conflating innocuous comments with abuse, and the second suggesting that the movement is creating a dangerous environment for men by making them vulnerable to the whims of women. And this divisive effect brings me to that second point about one of the key challenges of social media, which is virtue signaling, and the inclination to engage in virtue signaling over truly communicating and connecting with potential partners. Especially for millennials, but likely for all of us that are cultivating social identities on social media or off, we may find ourselves more inclined to employ virtue signaling than to reach across political boundaries. And given the way that public health is often framed, as Jean mentioned, which is often in a left-leaning way, we might be more likely to signal those values rather than to try to speak in a unifying way. But when it comes to collaborating, signaling is the least effective way to operate and isn't as effective as communicating rich public health messages that use all of the moral foundations or as building authentic connections and partnerships. In the context of the MeToo movement, I think this might be manifested in some ways by supporters of the movement signaling the righteousness of their beliefs and intentions by pointing to responses that they perceive as less pure and less righteous, even if those beliefs are espoused by someone who is supporting sexual violence prevention efforts. Some examples of this are included in the tweets on this slide, and I don't think this is uncommon at all, and don't. I think this is kind of a reaction many people have. One of the common controversial examples that comes to mind for me is that there are different opinions about the argument that sexual violence prevention efforts should be supported because someone values the safety of their wives, daughters, sisters, mothers, and that upsets others who argue that support for sexual violence prevention should be based on the fact that women are people rather than based on their relationship to men. And I think this clash might just reflect a difference in foundational moral values and unfortunately might prevent people from working together even where they have the same end goal. More broadly, even though the MeToo movement has created all kinds of great momentum around sexual violence prevention, if public health messengers insist on everyone articulating the same reasons and values as they do for addressing the problem, then the window of opportunity could be sacrificed in order to signal virtue. And so I wanted to close going back to that idea of cultivating a cause-focused mindset as a strategy for overcoming the instinct to signal virtue, because that cause-focused mindset compels a commitment to the what, or the desired policy outcome, over the why, which may be more about self-righteousness. And I'm perfectly guilty of this myself. A cause-focused mindset is more likely, I think, to accept support from partners without demanding loyalty to exactly the same cause. It's more likely to accept incremental change rather than demanding all or nothing. And of particular importance to building long-term partnerships, it assumes that the person I'm talking to is as smart and virtuous as I am and has the potential to be a great ally on a variety of public health goals, even if for slightly different reasons due to slightly different foundational moral values. And so if we stay focused on the cause rather than on signaling, I think it may be easier not only to communicate using the full range of moral values, but also to listen to, and collaborate and authentically engage with potential public health partners in a way that really capitalizes on the momentum of the MeToo movement. So I have a few references here in case anyone would like to do further reading, and I will pass it back over to Jean for the questions, and I look forward to your questions.
The conference has been unmuted.
Hi, this is Mandy from ASTO. So I think that we're going to go ahead with questions now. We just unmuted the line. We also have a few that came in ahead of time. So I'm going to pass it over to Jean now if he wants to dive into some of those. And then I see we have a few coming in the chat, but feel free to type those in as well.
Thank you. Thank you for bailing me out. I was talking to myself on mute here, so you did fine. So we have some questions that were previously provided. I noticed that there's a question already from Lainey Bell on social justice warriors. We will get to that in a minute. I wanted to drop down, though, and start off with that question number 8, which may be just a little bit unsettling for innocents walking in here that haven't been working like many of you folks have for the last 2 or 3 years on sexual violence prevention. So let's move out of the abstract and get into the nitty-gritty. So question number 8, how best to address slut shaming? How do you address people who talk about dressing modestly in order to prevent rape? So I will at least start on the first half of that. And I think, well, A, you don't need to take that bait. If you hear that. I think, as Colleen just abundantly pointed out, in the Me Too era and in the post-Harvey Weinstein era, I find it probably unusual that there would be an elected official or a high-level appointed official using that kind of terminology, particularly when they could end up on YouTube pretty quickly. But it is something that could run beneath the surface when you're out, because this is about network building and about building partnerships and reaching out to different groups. So if we could go back to slide, I think it's here, I can get it back, and one way of dealing with it, and there's no magic formula for doing this. You have to use your own. Here we go. Let's get back to the moral foundational values for 1 second. You can do it your way. There's no right or wrong to it. But if you're wanting in a situation to bridge from a comment like that, you can pick any of the moral foundational values and apply it to sexual violence prevention. So like care and harm, you can talk about, protecting from harm those in our community and caring for those that are suffering from it. Liberty and oppression, individuals have the right to be in public and not have fear, and certainly the right to be free from oppression and bullying. Fairness and cheating, you can again use the same point that people need to be treated fairly, and those who violate the rules get what they deserve. They could expect to being punished. So, after the fact, after the violence occurs, is not particularly consoling to those that are harmed by it. Loyalty and betrayal, you can truck on loyalty to your family, to your members of your family, of your community, etc. And those who betray should be isolated. You could replace Alexander the Great on authority and subversion with the policeman. Respect for authority, enforce the law, and intolerance of those who subvert. And then finally, sanctity and degradation. This is about protecting the elevated part of the human spirit and not tumbling into the degradation. So you can go this any number of ways, and you probably don't need to take the bait. Sue Lynn, you've dealt in this area. You want to comment on how common or rare it is that you get to that, but what you would do otherwise?
Certainly. In all the years, I have talked with various groups on some of these topics that are either the same as sexual violence or very related to. I have never heard that comment. And I'm not saying that it can't happen, but I agree with you that in this current climate, it would probably be political suicide to make a comment such as that. But I would have to say 25 years of experience, I have not heard any of those comments.
Colleen, you want to talk about beneath the surface?
Yeah, so I think I would also be shocked if anyone used those words. But I think that is a perspective that certainly could be encountered. And I wonder if you anticipate perspective, facing that perspective, it might make sense to figure out what your goal is in terms of a policy outcome or a strategy and intervention, and identify some of the co-benefits kind of that intervention, what else it's working towards, and then figure out which of those might resonate with the person you're talking with, and possibly just focus elsewhere. And I think that addressing that kind of perspective, I'm not suggesting that that's not a perspective worth addressing and that it's not problematic, as much as I think that incremental change might be necessary to achieving the goal of reducing sexual violence, and along with those incremental changes, culture and narrative change will accompany that. And so not having to get everyone board all at once to the same idea, it might be a more effective way to move forward
Okay.
in the moment.
Okay. Let's go. There was a nice question posed by Lainey Bell, which let's go ahead and go with that, which is how do you address the idea of a social justice warrior? I mean, my experience as a cancer survivor, you sort of go through this this passage of a cancer victim, to a cancer patient, to a cancer survivor, to a cancer advocate, and could go to a cancer warrior. I think clearly the passion, the emotion, the drive is what is absolutely necessary. I think there's a risk of becoming siloed in your values or the values that only apply, and we need to understand that we're looking to reach out to people who don't necessarily share our values, but will make a coalition. Sue-Lynn, you or Colleen want to take a quick swing at that? We got about 5 minutes to go here.
I would just agree with what you were saying. I think it's very important that you. It's easy for us to become warriors, and too often warriors have established enemies. And so if the enemy is the problem, that's okay. But if the enemy becomes the people that we are trying to persuade, that's not okay. So thinking of the problem as being the problem and learning to better communicate to the people.
So I wanted to also suggest, I mentioned my colleague Lizzie Corcoran with the De Beaumont Foundation a couple times because we've been working on this topic, and she wrote a great blog in which she kind of struggles with this issue and addresses it about those who go into public health with a focus on social justice and how can they branch from that to recognize the full range of moral foundations. And so I think she does a really great job with that issue in the blog post too. And can send out a link in the chat.
Okay. I'm looking at the clock, and I'm looking at Kimberly Mull's question. Great question from Nevada. How do you recommend framing sexual violence in MeToo in a state house with elected known perpetrators? Okay, well, that's so much for the high ground here. Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think the pendulum is swinging away from that direction of what you're referring to. Everybody is wondering to what extent will this momentum continue, but I personally would be surprised if we ever go back to that kind of standard. It is easy to get enraged by it, but again, I would recommend you don't take the bait when that is dangled in front of you, and you deal with sort of the positive messaging that can do. It's sort of like question number 5 alludes to up on your screen here. It's more effective in getting someone to become an advocate for you, to become a partner, to help in a coalition building, if you can find that common ground. And I mean, the lesson that Sue-Lynn has taught me is you sort of have to listen to that. You have to listen. You can't immediately go in and vomit out all 6 moral foundational values. Sort of listen and engage. And I mean, so you've tried to teach me that too many times, right?
No, I think you know that. I think you've got those good intuitive skills. But I do think that is key, and focusing on the person instead of the problem sometimes doesn't get you where you need to go.
Okay. I want to do one more question, but I'm mindful of the time. It's 2 minutes till. It's approaching 5 o'clock on the East Coast, so someone may have to drop out. So let me get to again, thanks everyone. Clearly, this is a work in progress for us. We've never done this presentation before, this particular one. So it would really be a favor for Sue Lynn and Colleen and myself and the other people working this, if you could take a minute and go to the evaluation link, which is shown there on your screen. If you have follow-up questions, we're not going to get to all of them here, but please feel free to contact myself or Colleen. Our email addresses are on the screen. I deliberately left Sue Lynn out because the General Assembly in North Carolina is in session right now, and she sleeps about 4 hours a night if she's lucky because of dealing with a lot of health care issues that are before the General Assembly in her backyard. So with that, let me go back to, it's really question number 5 that was on the screen here. How do you reach new audiences that may not agree with MeToo or our efforts? What should we be blogging about? And there's one particular issue. This is, again, I touched on it, but it's what our colleague Gary Gunnarsson, who's one of the top thought leaders in the country on faith-based health initiatives, points out, referring back to the work by Putnam, that it's a distinctive U.S. phenomenon of polarizing along lines of religion and politics. And in the real world, this ignores the lived complexity across the lines. We all have an Aunt Sue. We have a cousin Ralph. And they manage to live across some or all of the lines of religion and politics and race and gender and economic class. And that's what makes our life a little complex, a little messy, but we love, I love Cousin Ralph. Now, he doesn't fit necessarily in my particular group, but expect to be surprised by real people. You may encounter Cousin Ralph or Aunt Sue when you think you're dealing with someone that won't share the value of what you're wanting to do on sexual violence prevention. We can go another minute or two on this, but Sue Lynn, you or Colleen want to have a last word on this? I think you're on mute.
I think you hit the target. I think we're out of time, but I really would welcome questions that might continue to come in. So feel free to refer those questions. And it's just never, point counterpoint doesn't work so much. But yeah, just feel free to reach out.
And Colleen, you really make a great point about signaling versus communicating versus connecting. That applies to the all of public health. The coin of the realm of public health in the 21st century is social media. We all have to figure out how to use it and use it better, and not ourselves in public health signaling that we're have a particular virtue that's above and beyond anybody else's. Colin, you get the last word here, and they're doing brilliant work on millennials in the workforce. You feel free to plug that if you want.
Oh, I think you're right on point too, Jean. I'd love to talk further about this and chat about how that idea of signaling can get in the way and is such a it takes a different turn in social media, but I think it's something we all do a lot more often just in day-to-day communication in a politically divided, sometimes often environment. So
we're at time, and I see the question by, wait a minute, I lost it. Chantel Gaynor, is the link to the PowerPoint available? Yes, you're answering it. We'll send the slides along shortly. As I said at the top of the hour, this is all in the public domain. We're putting this out there. We'll probably have another article or two coming along shortly. One, Colleen and Lizzie are doing on the millennial aspects in the social media that they talked about, and then a larger piece on that piece I snuck in there at the end of mine on the public health advantage in this environment and the opening up of a desire for civil discourse. So don't forget to traffic on that. Be aware of it, look for it. I think public health will have an ability to move into that space and add value as we talked about there. Okay, it's 5:04 on the East Coast. We're 4 minutes overtime. Hopefully they won't dock my pay. I want to thank everybody again for this. If you have particular questions on it, you can email Colleen or myself. PowerPoints are coming out. And please give us some evaluation. If we stunk it up on part of this, let us know. If there are pieces that were helpful, we'd like to know that too. Thank you very much for everything. And Mandy or Jess, I turn it back over to you to take us out.
Great, yeah, thank you so much to Jean, Sue Lynn, and Colleen. That was really insightful, and we really appreciate that. So thanks again, and thank you all for joining. Have a great rest of your day.